तो मैं हिंदी में बोल देता हूँ, otherwise in English. जो भी आप, that you will be able to tell.
Okay, let's keep it in English, sir.
Okay, keep it in.
Namaste. Let us invoke the Divine Mother.
तत्सवितुर्वरं रूपं ज्योतिः परस्य धीमहि यन्नः सत्येन दीपयेत्।
Welcome everyone to the third chapter of Vaicārikī. Vaicārikī is an initiative for thoughts, dialogues and discussions initiated by Rostrum School of Public Leadership, Rishikesh University. This is a part of the 150th birth anniversary celebration of Sri Aurobindo and 75 years of India's independence. The title of today's topic is The Spirit of Indian Nationalism. According to Sri Aurobindo, nation was not just a superficial construct, but also had a subtle body embodying the thoughts, the literature, the philosophy, the mental and emotional activities, the sum of hopes, pleasures, aspirations, fulfilments, the civilization and culture. His vision of nationalism went beyond the search for a merely political ideal and transformed it into a spiritual goal, a way to recover Indian thought, energy and greatness, not only for India, but for the cause of the whole world. This chapter, titled The Spirit of Indian Nationalism, will reflect upon this idea of nationalism in the light of Sri Aurobindo's works. A panel discussion will expound on the various manifestations and contestations of nationalism as an idea and experience in India, and the need to preserve its Indian spirit. With this, I welcome Dr. Sampadananda Misra, Professor at Rostrum School of Public Leadership, to open the floor. He is a Sanskrit scholar and a lifelong student of Sri Aurobindo's philosophy and works. Welcome, sir.
Namaskar to all of you. As it is mentioned that this Vaicārikī, this is the third chapter. In the first chapter, we started with Sri Aurobindo's educational philosophy. And in the second chapter, we did a discussion on Varna, Jati and the integral perspective. And today we have the discussion on Sri Aurobindo's nationalism, the topic of nationalism. And we know that the very foundation of Sri Aurobindo's political philosophy is his whole idea of spiritual nationalism and the divinity of the motherland. So that is the reason that why Chittaranjan Das, he called Sri Aurobindo very rightly as the poet of patriotism, the prophet of nationalism, and the lover of humanity. And in Sri Aurobindo's political philosophy, we see, and especially when we contemplate on Sri Aurobindo's this whole concept of nationalism. So in one of his public meeting in Mumbai, in Bombay, in 1908, he said, nationalism is not a mere political program. Nationalism is a religion that has come from God. Nationalism is a creed which you shall have to live. If you are going to be nationalist, if you are going to ascend to this religion of nationalism, you must do it in the religious spirit. You must remember that you are the instrument of God. And we see in Sri Aurobindo's life, when he talked, whether he talked about the complete political freedom or complete independence, or whatever he has talked about the spiritual nationalism and the ideal of human unity, every phase of his life and what he wrote right in the beginning to his wife Mrinalini Devi, that as an instrument of God, he played his role as an instrument of God. And then we learn a lot from his life and from his writings what is the right spirit with which we should worship the Mother India. So, with this note, I welcome you all, and we're very happy that we have today Bharat Gupta ji and Anirvan Ganguly ji to give the keynote and guide us in this matter. And then we have Devdev Ganguly and Raghava Krishnan to contextualize and lead the discussion on this topic. So thank you all. And then we look forward to a very fruitful discussion on this very important topic, nationalism. Thank you.
Now, I welcome Professor Bharat Gupta to deliver the inaugural address. Professor Bharat Gupta is a former associate professor in English at University of Delhi. He is an Indian classicist, theatre theorist, sitar and surbahar player, musicologist, cultural analyst, and newspaper columnist. He believes villages and pilgrimages are the best places in India. Presently, he is a trustee and executive member at Indira Gandhi National Center for the Arts, IGNCA, New Delhi, under the Ministry of Culture, Government of India. I welcome sir to deliver the inaugural address. Namaste, sir.
Namaskar to everybody. Shri Guru Bhyo Namaha. I am deeply honored that I have this opportunity to speak at the function of the Rostrum School, which is a great upcoming center now. And I am so glad that I have this opportunity to address a subject which is of great importance in this very stressful hour, because our nation is facing all kinds of grave challenges today. So we must remember what our great men in the past have said about Indian nationalism and about India as a nation, because it is that which is going to steer us out of the storm that has engulfed us these days. So I begin a small talk of 20-25 minutes and tell you something about what Sri Aurobindo had to say. Of course, he has written volumes and volumes on it, as you all know. So I have chosen to speak upon what seems to me to be his very first statement, as you all know. That was the Uttar speech. And to my mind, that speech is one of the earliest statements. And that statement is something that holds right till the end of his writing, because it is on the spirit of that statement that he expounded. We have also to see what was the national situation at that time and why he had to make, or rather, why he had this great realization about the spiritual role of Sanatana Dharma, and why he made this very unequivocal statement. Today we are all confused and besotted with ideas which whenever we talk of Sanatana Dharma, ideas which encircle us in the name of plurality, in the name of secularism, in the name of modernity or ethnic diversity. But the real crux of what Sri Aurobindo said had taken into account all those things even at that time. And as a matter of fact, the very debates in which we are engaged today had very well begun around 1880s, especially when 1885, people like Sir Syed Ahmad had said very explicitly that as and when the British leave, then Hindus and Muslims will not be able to live together, and that they are something like two different nations. So it was as early as that something like a two-nation theory had come into being. It was not with Jinnah, please. It was with Sir Syed Ahmad. Historically, it is known. And it is at this point that great men like Sri Aurobindo took up the challenge. And in fact, it is Sri Aurobindo who stated the whole thing in very clear terms. Great men like Vivekananda, by whom, of course, Aurobindo was inspired, had looked upon the things more in spiritual and cultural terms. But Sri Aurobindo gave us an idea of Sanatana Dharma, which covered nationalism in very explicit terms. Now, Sri Aurobindo, as you know, when he came out of the Alipur jail after serving there for 1 year, gave this speech. And he said that when he went to jail, at that time, the whole country was resounding with the sounds of Vande Mataram. And now he felt, that is when he was out of the Alipur jail, that there was some kind of a brief lull. And it seems that there was some kind of a disappointment at that time, and people thought that the upsurge of nationalism had abated. So Sri Aurobindo comes and gives this message. And the first thing he says is that he is addressing a religious society. He is addressing a religious issue, but then he says that he is not going to talk about theology. He is going to talk about the most important thing in the context of religion at that time, and that was Indian nationalism. So he says that very clearly, that it was Hindu nationalism that he is going to talk about, and he equates it very, very clearly with Sanatana Dharma. Now, this should make it very clear in our minds that he was not going to address some deep issue about the nature of what is called Hindu religious beliefs, but because he knew that all those religious beliefs or theology or culture by which India proclaims its identity is rooted in the sense of Dharma. So you can find here the first statement on Dharma in the context of nationalism. And it is a statement which is very clear and unequivocal. Today, after something like 70 years of Nehruvian socialism in the practice and air and political conflict and whatnot, and various other theories of nationalism, we find ourselves very hesitant in trying to accept the fact that for India, Dharma is an essential, or rather a fundamental concept which covers each and everything in our lives. And therefore, it has to cover our political life, our national life, our cultural life, our independence as a nation, and our progress into future. Future is very important because as Sri Aurobindo said, that we don't have to only see the sunrises of the past, but also the afternoons of the future. So the whole concept of Sanatana, something which is not limited to a single period, was stated by him. This is the first thing that he said. But what he said and explained to people was his experience. You see, I find that particular speech, which is not very long, and in terms of text, it's about five pages or so, very crucial, because Sri Aurobindo gives an account of one of the fundamental experiences of his life. And this was that when he went to jail, he was a political worker. He was a great nationalist on whom the thought that sat heaviest on his mind was the freedom of India. And he felt that the freedom struggle had not begun at that time, and that the goal of India's independence was far, far away. So that brought his spirit down, and he didn't know how to come out of those very sad and depressed thoughts. And this was the paramount feeling with which he went into the jail and stayed for some months. And it is there that the transformation took place. He says that he had the great experience about which he had read earlier. He had read in the Bhagavad Gita, he had read in the Upanishads, he had read in several things, although by that time, as he himself admits, he was not a great scholar of classical Hindu texts, but he had an idea, some sort of an idea. But before all that, he had this crucial experience in jail. What was this experience? The experience was all is Vasudev. So the Mahavakya Sarvamidam Khalu Brahma, which has been stated in the Upanishads and which we take to be the cornerstone of Indian philosophy, was something that he experienced. Now, this is very important. We must understand that he experienced this all. It was not something about which he thought and made an opinion or wrote a book about or formulated an opinion which he could circulate, or a dogma or a political system or a thought. No, it was a direct experience. For those of us who have some inkling of what is Indian philosophy, people like us who are dependent upon the great words of sages like Sri Aurobindo and others in our tradition, for those of us who depend upon what has been told to us, we have heard that it is not a statement, it is not even a Mahavakya as stated in words, but it is a Swanabhuti, experience by yourself, which makes us realize the truth. As Bhartrihari has said, that Shiva is Swanabhutyam Ekamanam. He is the only criteria of self-experience. So this self-experience of Vasudev, that all is Vasudev, the friend and foe, brown and white, Englishman and Indian, whosoever was there in the jail was one. And it is after this great experience, he also had two, he says so, he had two messages from the divine. Now, this is important to understand as to why Sri Aurobindo said that Indian nationalism is Sanatana Dharma, or that India is Sanatana Dharma and Sanatana Dharma is India, because he experienced it. He himself came to understand this. And he says in this very speech that all doubts were cleared, that he had been some sort of a doubting person, semi-atheist, questioning man. But after this profound experience, all doubts were cleared, and he was able to understand and see and perceive and feel and rise to that level of consciousness in which India is Sanatana Dharma and Sanatana Dharma is India. So what he said to his audience in the Uttar Pada speech is something he experienced firsthand. The important thing which he came to realize was that he should give up the anxiety of winning the freedom for India, and that he was assured that Vasudev tells him that he has started the work, and Aurobindo is only a small speck in that great movement. And out of these two messages, Vasudev tells him to do the work of Vasudev, number one, and number two, that India is Sanatana Dharma. So it is a divine message, so to speak, that Sri Aurobindo has. This is the realization in terms of Swanubhuti, and it is in terms of this great understanding. Now you can see that this is a definition of India. This is an idea of India. You know, this phrase idea of India is very common, and many people have written books about this phrase, or taking a kind of a resting place on this phrase idea of India. I would say that to describe the experience of Sri Aurobindo, it is better to say that it is neither a perception of India for Sri Aurobindo, nor a view of India, nor just an experience of India, but the deepest realization of the truth of India. So the truth of India, what really India is known to him through that experience in the Alipur jail in that 1 year period. And that changes his whole perception as a political worker. Because at this point, he was still somebody who was striving for the freedom of the country and working as an individual, as a political person as well, apart from all other things. It is later on that he decides to go in for yoga only and to work at a higher level. But at the terrestrial level, this was the work still being done, and this was the message given to him. Now, what is the significance of this message? The significance of the message is that here you have a deep vision of India as Sanatana Dharma. And this was the idea which was taken up later on by Veer Savarkar. As a matter of fact, when you read the 1923 work Hindutva by Savarkar, he at that time when he published his book, he gave his name as Maratha. Then you find that it is essentially the same vision. Of course, there are some seeming differences. Now, please mark my words. I am saying seeming differences because Sri Aurobindo states in the Uttar speech that Sanatan Dharma and rise of Sanatan Dharma and rise of Sanatan Dharma in India is the rise of India, but it is not just for this territory or this piece of land, so to speak, called India, but it is for the whole world. And he makes it in many words very clear that Sanatan Dharma is neither a mere theological category, because it has the capacity to include the well-being of the whole cosmos or all Srishti. So you can see that definition of Sanatan Dharma as given by Sri Aurobindo is not nationalistic in terms of the nation state only. It is not in terms of a region of the world. It is not just in terms of the cultural or ethnographic or historical experience of a nation called India. But through the agency of all these, it is for the whole of the world. And he says that if there is rise of India, then that is going to benefit the whole world. So what we today in various other words like Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam, etc., are stating it again and again, Sri Aurobindo had made it very clear that this vision of Sanatan Dharma is the vision of the eternal. And what is eternal is not something which can be closely demarcated within a territory, but it is something which has to be for the whole of humanity. So this is the definition of Sanatan Dharma. Now, by the time we come to say 1920, many other political changes happen. As I mentioned right in the beginning of my talk, that the two-nation theory had been stated. And it is as a counter to that limited vision of two nations, Hindu versus Muslim, that Sri Aurobindo had given this great, profound experience about the truth and reality of India. That is why he calls it Sanatan Dharma. Later on, by the time we come to Savarkar, Savarkar gives it a nationalistic definition in terms of a territory. Now, this had become very important because in 1920, something very significant happened. It was not only significant, it was almost tragic. And that was a repetition of the two-nation theory in a different form, which was unfortunately at this time endorsed by none other than Mahatma Gandhi. That is, in 1920, Mahatma Gandhi had talked about the Khilafat, and he had encouraged the Indian Muslims to pledge faithfulness and service to the Khalifa of the Ottoman Empire and to go and fight for him. And I think it was around 30 or 40,000 Indian Muslim youth who had gone there to fight for him. So when this idea that people can go from outside the Indian subcontinent and go and serve a leader of the Ummah or leader of the Caliphate or the Caliph, Khalifa as he was called, and when a leader like Mahatma Gandhi was endorsing it, supporting it, then certain boundaries had to be made. And Savarkar came up with the idea that India nationalism is to be defined in terms of Hindu and Hindutva. And then, of course, you all know that he gave the definition of Hindu. Sindhu Sindhu Pariyanta Yasya Bharat Bhumika Pitra Bhumischa Punya Bhumischa Sahinduriti Smrata. The idea that this is the territory, and one who considers this as his fatherland, motherland, and is his holy land is Hindu, and this is Hindu nationalism. But remember that Savarkar is only taking a piece out of Sri Aurobindo. Sri Aurobindo has given the deepest, the widest, and the fullest meaning of the whole thing. And it is this fullness which we have to realize. I suppose that once we realize as Indians, as Bharatiyas, as people born here, as people having the faith in Sanatana Dharma, you see, not just the faith as Hindu, but the faith as a Sanatani. Sanatani, not as some Arya Samajis would like to call it in terms of person who worships Murti, not in that limited sense, but in the most wide sense, in the profoundest and the deepest sense, which Sri Aurobindo used the word Sanatana Dharma. So Sanatana Dharma then begins in terms of texts, it begins with the Rig Veda or the earliest text of this country, right up to the times of the modern times and the vision of the great Rishi. In terms of lived experience and culture, it is all the languages, it is all the experiences that the people of this land have, and it is also, as he said, Sri Aurobindo said, the totality of existence. So his definition, Aurobindo's definition of Sanatana Dharma is not just humanitarian. You see, it is not integral humanism, or it is not ekatmatavad, manav ekatmatavad or something like that. It is much bigger. It is something which goes to the core of existence, because India has that vision. He tries to make that point, and he tries to make us aware of that point. And once we are aware of it, then without any sense of hesitation, we should be able to accept that the definition of Sanatana, as given by Aurobindo, as given by many other saints, you see, there are hundreds of verses which have this fourth pad or the fourth charan, Dharmo Esha Sanatana. You see, there are hundreds of verses in Indian tradition, Satyam Bruyat, Priyam Bruyat, Nabruyat, Satyam Apriyam, etc., and ending with Dharmo Esha Sanatana. So there are so many verses in our tradition that talk about it in terms of practical enunciations. And we have to understand the depth and the expanse of this thing as given to us by Sri Aurobindo. Thank you very much for giving me a patient ear.
Thank you, sir, for your wonderful talk. And I don't think there could be a better explanation of India's form of nationalism other than the famous Uttar speech that Sri Aurobindo gave. And indeed, India's nationalism draws from the vast repertoire of its spirituality, and which is mainly experiential rather than any kind of levels that are being thrown at us. Now, I would like to welcome Dr. Anirban Ganguly for his keynote address. Dr. Anirban Ganguly is director of Dr. Shama Prasad Mukherjee Research Foundation. It's a public policy think tank. He is an author, political activist, and public policy analyst. He is fascinated by India's independent India's political evolution and complex history. He is a scholar of civilization, politics, history, and culture. He is also the member of National Executive Committee of Bharatiya Janata Party. I welcome sir to today's keynote address.
Thank you so much for this very kind introduction in front of Professor and Doctor, our very dear friend and elder, Professor Bharat Gupt. Unke samne mujhe scholar of civilization mat kahiye. Because I have my early years in Delhi. He was one of those with whom one would really have a near daily interaction. And those were very difficult initial years for all of us, because we have seen the past decade, and we have seen how the narrative of India, of Bharat, has built up. And Bharatji is one of those who have stuck to defining that Bharat, which very few would define even a decade ago. So I think it's a great honor to be here, to be able to listen to him, to listen to him and to see him once again, especially to the Rostrum school. Also, I'm extremely thankful that Sampadananji insisted that I participate here. My younger friend Devdeep Ganguly is also here. I think one introduction which would be most relevant here, because all the others that you have said are all ornamental. But for our purpose, for this discussion, one introduction would just have been sufficient, and that I have spent 20 years of my 20 formative years in Sri Aurobindo Ashram in Pondicherry. And I've had the unique fortune to have grown up in the school, in the center of education established by the mother that is named after Sri Aurobindo. And I don't know what I must have done, what I must have done in one of my previous incarnations, but I'm certainly extremely fortunate to be able to have lived 2 decades of my life in the ashram. Just about 2-3 days ago, I'm now back in Delhi, but touring West Bengal, and it was extremely late at night. I was coming back from a particular district. The national highway was clogged very badly, and we would have got caught up for an hour. That's when, just by an instinct, I asked the convoy to take a turn, and I said, look, we can take Uttar, and through Uttar we'll have a clear road to Kolkata. So that saved me 1 hour. And actually, Uttar late past midnight actually illumined the way for us to go ahead. So as Bharatji was talking, I was thinking, we crossed the Jai Krishna library late at night. I caught a glimpse of it. And I just hope that, I just wish that someday it would be better maintained and taken care of. Someday people would realize the sanctity, the historicity of that place, and it could perhaps again become a pilgrim spot for the arising new India. Friends, I really don't know what more can I say after what Bharatji has said, because, and I would urge all of you to read a lot of what he has written, what he has spoken of over the last few decades. He has encapsulated, I think, so well Sri Aurobindo's espousal of Rashtravad, of nationalism, especially a nationalism which is not limited to its milieu, or a nationalism which is not limited to its era or epoch. A nationalism which is self-renewing, and which carries on from age to age. You see, it's very interesting that there are two very interesting expositions. One, Swami Vivekananda's on New India, and Sri Aurobindo in 1908, writing in his unpublished piece in for the Bande Mataram, The Bourgeois and the Samurai, Sri Aurobindo speaks about a new nationalism. And if one were to look at India today, at Bharat today, it is clearly evident that one sees the rise of that new nationalism, that India bases itself on that new nationalism that Sri Aurobindo spoke about in 1908, and the new India that Swami Vivekananda speaks about is also that India that we are witnessing today. I shall just read out excerpts from both. Swamiji says, "Let a new India arise out of the peasant's cottage, grasping the plough, out of the hearts of the fisherman, the cobbler and the sweeper. Let her spring from the grocer's shop, from beside the oven of the fritter seller. Let her emanate from the factory, from the marts and from the markets. Let her emerge from the groves and forests, from the hills and the mountains." This is the new India that Swami Vivekananda spoke of in 1897. And very interesting to note the manner in which he says, grocer's shop, fritter seller, sweeper, the cobbler, the fisherman. Sri Aurobindo writes about the new nationalism which overleaps every barrier. It calls to the clerk at his counter, the trader in his shop, the peasant at his plough. It summons the Brahmin from his temple and takes the hand of the Chandala in his degradation. It seeks out the student in his college, the schoolboy at his books. It touches the very child in its mother's arms, and the secluded Zenana has thrilled to its voice. Its eye searches the jungle for the Santal and travels the hills for the wild tribes of the mountains. It cares nothing for age or sex or caste or wealth or education or respectability. It cries to all to come forth, to help in God's work and remake a nation, each with what his creed or his culture, his strength, his manhood or his genius can give to the new nationality. The only qualification it asks for is a body made in the womb of an Indian mother, a heart that can feel for India, a brain that can think and plan for her greatness, a tongue that can adore her name, or hands that can fight in her quarrel. Friends, I think you'll agree with me when I say that this is an India, this is a new nationalism, this is the new nationalism that we are seeing manifesting before us today. In terms of expansion, in terms of inclusion, in terms of a rising consciousness and empowerment, both at all levels, be that political, be that economic, be that educational, a churning awareness that has come about, a rising consciousness that India can collectively rise, can attain the past position of a Vishwa Guru only when all her parts, all her dimensions move ahead equally and are empowered comprehensively. We are passing, and I always remember this, we are passing through a very interesting phase. It is 150th year of Sri Aurobindo's birth. It is the 75th year of India's independence. It is the centenary also of a scholar, an intellectual Kshatriya like Sitaram Goel. And we have just completed the centenary of a phenomenal and fascinating mind like Sri Dharampal. Bharatji has met and closely interacted with perhaps all of them, with these two that I have mentioned. We have interacted with them through their books and through their thoughts. Philosopher Ram Swarupji makes a very interesting point when he speaks about India's freedom movement. And I'm also extremely positive and I'm extremely hopeful when I see that even in an area which used to be the stranglehold of a certain ideologically motivated historians and interpreters, the history of the freedom movement of India, there is a call given out of democratizing that narrative of India's freedom movement, of including all those who contributed but were left out, to start with Sri Aurobindo himself. And if one were to look at this aspect, and Ram Swarup, philosopher, interpreter of Indian traditions and parampara, Ram Swarup ji says something very interesting. He says that, well, the freedom movement started, the Congress was founded. It was primarily founded by, in order to be able to give vent to a lot of angst that was developing, 1885. So that was at a very gross, material, political level. But then gradually, and then all of a sudden, a turn became visible. And that was the contribution of personalities like Swami Dayanand, Swami Vivekananda, and Sri Aurobindo. They were pioneers. They were not politicians, obviously, as we understand the term today. They were philosophers. They were cultural thinkers. They spoke of God, humanity. They spoke of larger life, of truth, of Sanatana Dharma, and of Ram Rajya. And they imparted a deeper dimension to the nationalism, the rising spirit of nationalism. So when we say the new spirit of nationalism, today we see the new spirit of nationalism incarnating, embodying, or manifesting itself through the past prediction of what that spirit of nationalism would be. And if we look at the early years of the awakening of that phase, it is a very interesting aspect that when there was a period when a large number, a section of the Indian intelligentsia were, the majority are educated and articulate class, paid allegiance to the Western ideals. I mean, even before Macaulay's Minutes, John Trevelyan writes that, it's very interesting that after a certain point, or the summit of the ambitions of Indians whom we are teaching or whom we are orienting, the summit of their ambition is to resemble us. It's a very interesting point, a very perceptive observation that he made. The summit of their ambition is to resemble us. It was in this period, at this stage of the awakening, and gradually when we go into the 1880s, even at that point, freedom was obviously a very distant goal. There was no question of, even dominion status was being very vaguely talked about. The talk about dominion status came much later. But at that point of time, for example, if one were to take Gopal Krishna Gokhale's Servants of India Society, the preamble to the Servants of India Society, which stated, and I'm not making a commentary on any individual leader, but it's just that I'm making an observation of the objective with which they pushed forward this movement. And it was that the Servants of India Society, if one were to take example of that, frankly accept the British connection as ordained in the inscrutable dispensation of providence for India's good, even if self-government within the empire was a goal which could not be attained without years of earnest and patient effort and sacrifice worthy of the cause. So basically the idea was that the colonial connection was preordained by providence. It was at this point of time that one can say an ancient nation was waking up. And that is where the consciousness of nationalism was infused into the movement, which was hitherto a plain and simple political demand, which was a very moderate, a very attenuated political demand. And the old assumptions started getting hit. great cultural thinkers. And there's one thing that we need to remember. They were not only cultural thinkers, they were not philosophers, they were sadhakas also, who rose and they spoke of their cultural heritage, about Vedas, about Sanatana Dharma with pride. And at the same time, personalities like Sri Aurobindo gave Swami Vivekananda, gave a close look at Western culture and found it wanting in deeper matters. Sri Aurobindo, at the height of his political movement, says, we reject the claim of aliens to force upon us a civilization inferior to our own, or to keep us out of our inheritance on the untenable ground of a superior fitness. This was something which was completely lacking. The new nationalism, the new spirit of nationalism brought this into the entire movement. That we have a cultural spiritual identity. We had a civilizationally a role that we played in the past. Therefore, when we demand political freedom, when a political awakening is taking place, that awakening can only be sustained, can be long-term, can be solid, if it stands itself on this consciousnness, that it is not only a political recovery, but a cultural spiritual recovery as well. The new spokespersons, as I term, taught us to look at the country and its independence struggle in a very unique way. They told us that India was more than a geographical entity, that it was a holy land, that it was a sacred land. It was a sacred trust, a spiritual idea, a power of the spirit, even a deity, not merely a piece of land. Sri Aurobindo's famous his famous utterance, which especially many were fond, many referred to it. They taught that India was rising for the truth. It embodied and so importantly, India was rising to recover her swabhava. Atma Smriti, Atma Vismriti, as Dharampalji says. Atma Smriti. And this consciousness is what was spread by Sri Aurobindo in later years, initiated by Swami Vivekananda and Swami Dayanand, to name a few. And this gave a deeper ideation. What happened is that this layer gave a deeper ideation to the struggle, a deeper definition of India, and it gave a deeper raison d'etre for our political struggle. In a sense, it gave a new focus to the goal and to the objective. So I think it's very important to understand, and as historian R.C. Majumdar says it, wonderfully refers to it. He says that, and Sri Aurobindo in his tribute to Lokmanya Tilak, I would urge all of you to read that. It's an excellent tribute to Lokmanya Tilak. And R.C. Majumdar later explains it in a very interesting way. He says that gradually, from a level of elitism, the new nationalism, this word new nationalism, the new party that Sri Aurobindo continuously uses in various of his writings in Vande Mataram. R.C. Majumdar says that gradually from that level, the politics, the demand, the movement, the nationalist movement, the movement for freedom and independence percolated on the ground. It percolated in mandaps, in bazaars, and in roads and streets. It's a very interesting definition that R.C. Majumdar gives. So we see a very interesting synergy here. On the one hand, a deep dimension, adhyatmic dimension is infused into the political demand. On the other hand, it is also brought down from the rarefied atmospheres onto the ground. In the sense, it clicks, it resonates with the masses who feel that our ways, our paramparas, our way of living, our way of worshipping, our cultural way of being is something which we need to be free to be able to readapt to. And for that, political freedom is also needed. As you know, K.C. Bhattacharya in his Swarajin Idea says it beautifully. He makes a definition between cultural subjection and political subjection. Political subjection is something which you feel. Cultural subjection is subtle. He says it possesses you like a ghost because you don't feel it initially. What Sri Aurobindo did very clearly and very emphatically was to combine these two. That India needs to be free for Jagata Hitaya. India needs to be free in order to play her legitimate role globally. And India needs to be also free in order to realize her full potential at all levels. I mean, because otherwise it'll end up as a quote citation session. There's a beautiful definition in his Doctrine of Passive Resistance. It's right here behind me in the volume. It's all marked there. A beautiful definition about statecraft, about how a country ought to be run, and what kind of approaches and persons and mentalities needed in order to run a free country. Sri Aurobindo speaks about, at one point, if you look at his writings, he's concerned about what India is going to do with her freedom. The question of India achieving her freedom is settled, he says. But the larger question is what India is going to do with her freedom. And he uses the term, is it going to be Bolshevism or Gunda Raj? In the 30s, he uses the term Gunda Raj, which we keep using, later on also. Now, as I see it today, if we know that in 1948, Sri Aurobindo delivered his last message, public message, so to say, to the Andhra University. And he had clearly stated there that his apprehensions about India pursuing power politics, developing a formidable army, evolving as a major economic power, but in the process, India forfeiting her soul, her cultural and spiritual soul, which sets her apart from other nations. He says the danger is there, but it will surely not happen. Friends, if we look at India today, and there's one point that I keep making here, and I would urge all of you to read the early editorials of Mother India also, the early editorials, 49, 1950, which was supposed to have been vetted by Sri Aurobindo and then published. One sees that throughout his life, he may have renounced active politics, but Sri Aurobindo was completely, apart from the epochal sadhana that he did, Sri Aurobindo was also very plugged in, to use a very, current terminology, extremely plugged into the politics of his days. I mean, be it the hegemony, the communist hegemony of his time, the war in the Korean Peninsula, invasion of Tibet, be it the partition and its aftermath, that is the entire refugee influx that was taking place, the situation in East Bengal, which was East Pakistan, the situation there, the extreme atrocities that were taking place on the Bengali Hindu refugees. His concern with Kashmir, his concern with Kashmir, which needed to be integrated with India in order to prevent it from going into the ambit of Pakistan. His concern with India's national emblems, with India's national language, with the formation of states. His concern with the communist insurrection within free India, just after independence, all of it. If one were to look at the entire gamut of the areas that he covered in these few years after independence, it is phenomenal. And so therefore, I have always argued that, yes, it was a strict no politics in the ashram. Obviously, you were not expected to indulge in party politics in the ashram, or you were not expected to indulge in party politics once you have taken up the spiritual life. But politics as national welfare, politics as governance, politics as service, politics as determining the future of India, an India that he wished to, the kind of India that he wished to or hoped to see, I think he was extremely closely following. One needs to just go through the obituary that was written in the Times literary supplement on Sri Aurobindo, or the Times of India. I think I'm slightly mixing up, but which says that for a recluse, he was remarkably up to date. These are not the exact words, but he was remarkably up to date on the political situation in the country and across the world. So therefore, if we look at that new nationalism, and if we look at what Sri Aurobindo espoused, or the positions that he enunciated indirectly, because he himself could not take a public political position. The last position that he took was supporting the Allied war efforts in 1942 and supporting the Cripps proposal, and then the cabinet mission plan also. But post-independence, Sri Aurobindo speaks about the need for a cultural reintegration. It is there in his letter to K. Munshi, when K. Munshi writes to him saying that, indicating that the rebuilding of Somnath temple is, he has initiated the rebuilding of the Somnath temple. Sri Aurobindo speaks about reintegration of Indian culture under modern conditions. Sri Aurobindo expresses his concern about the existence of Pakistan and the impact that it would make on India militarily, geographically, and in terms of human, in terms of people. He is extremely concerned about the situation of the refugees, especially on the Eastern Front. Sri Aurobindo, throughout, when he writes about a new, he writes about a national education for India, he is very clear that a free India needs a new education approach. A free India needs a new education thinking. He is very clear about, also, he's extremely clear about India protecting, despite partition, India protecting her geographical sanctity. And in fact, at times he may come across as a hardliner. I mean, to use I say he comes across as a truth liner rather than a hardliner. So if we look at this, if we look at the sequence today, 75 years after Sri Aurobindo gave his message on 15th August 1947, we'll clearly see that, one, there's a huge mass inclusion. The leftists would say subalterns. We say a mass consciousness, a mass participation, an inclusive and participative approach to the creation, to taking India forward. That is something which is visible today in terms of inclusivity of all kinds, at all levels. Recovery of our cultural symbols, and that is evident with the building of the Ram Mandir in Ayodhya, with a large number of our Dev and Devis, Murtis coming back, being hunted out and being brought back to India and sent back to their respective places where they used to be worshipped for ages. For 108 years, Ma Annapurna's Murti was out of India. 75 years free India, 75 years of free India, no one thought that in a land which used to be full, which never faced food scarcity, from that land, the Murti of Ma Annapurna was smuggled out, and there were no attempts to bring it back. So friends, when I say cultural self-recovery, this is taking place at various levels. I speak about the most visible, physical manifestation of those. Recovery of India's artifact, 75% having taken place, and the largest which took place was during this period, in the last 8 years. It is just not fortuitous. It is just not by chance. It has a deeper symbolism behind it. There's a large corpus of literature which is being churned out, countering the India narrative or the idea of India narrative that went on for decades. It used to be only one idea of India. You had to subscribe to it in order to gain intellectual respectability and access. If you differed from that idea of India, and if you had your own idea of India, which was more connected to the real idea of India, you were marginalized. That is being resoundingly challenged now. We have a large number of scholars, young scholars, coming up with their research, coming up with their publications, coming up with their understanding of India, of Bharat, of India's traditions. Misinterpretation of India's parampara. Bharatji is not alone anymore. He has inspired, and there's an army, there's a gradual army building up with him and behind him to counter those misperception or appropriation of the India narrative by vested interest. So this intellectual clash, this intellectual counter is taking place. You have scholars like Meenakshi Jain churning out one after another opuses, starting from Vasudeva of Mathura, the latest, going back to Ram of Ayodhya, and challenging, many scholars like her challenging basic positions which we had accepted or considered to in the last 75 years. The hesitancy of respecting our religious and cultural symbols publicly is diluting and melting away. And in this, I would also, cultural recovery, I would also include the bold step of the CAA, because it is necessary to contextualize it. The CAA reasserts, rekindles in us the consciousness that we are a civilizational power, that our people who owe allegiance to the concept of Bharat Mata, to the vision of Bharat Mata, are spread across the world. And in times of difficulty, in times of need, it is Bharat which stands by them. This consciousness that they are our, since they look upon Bharat as their motherland, it delves on us. It is our responsibility as Free Bharat to stand and to buy them and to go to their succor. This is an important psychological, a very symbolic portion of our narrative of cultural self-recovery. We don't forsake them anymore, or we don't say that we are helpless and we cannot stand by you. The national education policy, and some of you here may have had the good fortune of working with Professor Kirit Joshi, late Professor Kirit Joshi. The national education policy, the new education policy, call it whatever you wish to. 30 years ago, it was Dr. Kirit Joshi who had formulated the national education policy in the 1980s. It's a very interesting symbolic thing when I look back. Directly inspired and, trained by the mother, having dived deep into Sri Aurobindo's educational philosophy. And 30 years later, 3 decades later, India has a national education policy on the eve of Sri Aurobindo's 150th year, which speaks about the 21st century being India's century, which speaks about the need for such an education which will prepare India for the 21st century, which is not apologetic about spiritual dimension of education, which is not apologetic about the cultural aspect of education, and which feels that these are integral to an education policy that is to be followed by India. And I don't even want to, I think all of us are extremely well versed. We are conscious about the kind of cultural spread that India has undertaken in the last few years, and the kind of global support that it has received, starting from yoga to vaccine to cultural diplomacy to forming global institutions which are concerned with the future of the world. India has taken the initiative. India has brought world countries together. And this has happened, and this is happening as we see it. And so therefore, in 1948, 74 years ago, Sri Aurobindo's flagging that point, that in India, pursuing power politics should not forsake her deeper soul, is also something which is being consciously addressed today. Friends, I just had these ideas. I think the sense of Indian exceptionalism, why should it be only American exceptionalism? Every civilization is exceptional. The sense of an Indian exceptionalism, that we are and we want to emerge as a power, as a major power, as a relevant power, as a responsible power, but a power which has again something unique to give to the world in terms of, not only in terms of governance models, in terms of the way we manage crisis, but also in terms of contextualizing our deeper knowledge. And even in terms of the way we have handled the crisis of pandemic. Western thinkers, like all on one side, Kishore Mahbubani, Francis Fukuyama, Richard Haas, all of them speak of a turn eastward post-COVID. Whenever that post-COVID world comes. But they speak of a clear turn eastward. Why? Because the East has been able to handle such a once in a century crisis much better than the West has been able to. And in that handling by the East, the India story is a major story. This is the physical aspect. On the other hand, the way percolation of not only yoga, but the sense that Indian civilization, Bharatiyata, offers an alternative and a new and a more reliable and sustained way of living. This consciousness is also percolating across the world. And so therefore, at the end, I would like to say, I say that since we are rising, since it's the spirit of new nationalism which is establishing itself, we see a lot of Asuric onslaught also. Sri Aurobindo would have termed it Asuric onslaughts of all kinds, which want to retard India's rise. But obviously that rise is not, one cannot stop or one cannot arrest that rise anymore. And more importantly, the new nationalism, spirit of nationalism that drives India is imbued with the essence of what Sri Aurobindo had envisaged. And therefore, India does not rise driven by that sense of a century of humiliation. Our large neighbor in the north drives itself by the sense of a century of humiliation. Since they were humiliated for a century by Western powers, since they were humiliated and occupied by Western powers, they have to rise and dominate the world. India is not driven by a sense of a century of humiliation. India continues to be driven by that original urge, which was infused into her political movement for freedom. And that urge which says, India rise India rises for the welfare of the world. She rises in order to restore and maintain a balance in the world. She rises in order to make the world, link the world with its original essence of creation. So, friend, I think it was a very, it's a very complex, topic, because each of us have a way of looking at it. But for me, for my current role, there's something that I constantly go back to in Sri Aurobindo, and that is, to contextualize him in our current challenges of nation building or leading the nation. And I am certain that on the 75th year of India's independence and 150th year of his birth and the 75th year of his message to free India, we are resolutely moving towards that India which he had broadly evinced a hope in. Thank you so much for this opportunity to be able to share some thoughts here with this very august gathering. Thank you so much.
Thank you for the wonderful address. And listening to you, I was just struck by the writings of Sri Aurobindo, where he mentions in the Renaissance of India that the rise of India will come when we soak ourselves in the Indian spirituality, and out from the old we create the new forms of our polity and several facets of our society. He also mentions that it is a weak argument that how do we assimilate the several centuries of the influence we had in our culture. It is generally said that we assimilate what is good and we leave out the rest, but he says that this is a position of a weak mind. First we should strengthen ourselves, then only we will be able to understand what to assimilate and what not to assimilate. My question to you, sir, before we move on to the panel discussion, as you and we see a rise of a assertive India, on a scale, how do you see that we have been able to create new forms of institutions, new forms of ideas that would be futuristic, as Sri Aurobindo has said, in several facets of our society, may it be polity, society, or culture? How do you see we are successful, or are we on the right path, or is nationalism taking a path of xenophobia?
No, you see, I'll go backward. One is, in our context, nationalism can never take a direction of xenophobia. Xenophobia is something which in the West they are very familiar with. The issue is, I think this is an intense period of journey. What is nationalism? In the Indian context and in the context of Sri Aurobindo and thinkers later, and Bharatji also mentioned Pandit Deendayal Upadhyay, those who post-independence spoke of nationalism from the Bharatiya dimension. One clearly sees in the spirit of nationalism, in the spirit of new nationalism, an assertion that we too have a right to define ourselves. We have a right to shape our narrative. We have a right to interpret what we stand for. This is a very clear spirit. This is a very clear approach in the new nationalism. This was something that was denied to us. It was always second-hand, or as Sitaramji says, satellite ideologies. You had satellite, you functioned, we were compelled to function as satellites of a different ideology. Whereas we ourselves, we had such a rich philosophical darshan the darshanik, the darshan shastras which were there, we had our own, as K.C. Bhattacharya says very interestingly, that, it's all very good. Look, we have read Western thinkers, we interpret them, etc., etc. That's fine. But have we decided where do we stand? What is our position? And that position can only be defined from the term of India's interest, from the term of India's forward movement. You cannot retard India and parrot some other position. I think that mentality, that mindset, not mentality, that mindset, that perception is very clearly asserting itself. You speak about institutions that are, I see this as a period of huge churning, and lot of symbolism, lot of apparent things are happening which have a deep, laden with deep symbolism. I mean, for example, your Rostrum School of Public Leadership and Governance. What are you trying to do through this? You are trying to espouse a very Bharatiya approach to public leadership, public policy and governance. 10 years back, you did not exist. 15 years back, nobody thought that an institution such as yours ought to be formed. You had just some islands, this center of education in Pondicherry, and luckily mother refused to put it under the under a board or something which would completely crush his spontaneity. We know what has happened to Shantiniketan and Vishwabharati. Today we see many such institutions coming up, or there is an attempt to bring up such institutions. So I see a lot of churning taking place also. This is a period of churning and preparation. We'll see the effect of this in another decade. 75 years we did not have our own parliament building. Apparently it's a very mundane issue. People will say, oh, it's politics, let's not discuss it. But why did we not think that for a free India's parliament, democracy, we term it the temple of democracy, should be functioning out of a building which was constructed during the colonial era and which had no structural affinity to our ethos. It took 75 years to do something like that. I'm not commenting on whether the structure itself will be good or bad, but the fact that it did not happen and it is happening now, it is symbolic. Ananda Kumaraswamy, amongst many issues that he had raised at that time, said one thing. He said that free India must ensure that her public buildings must reflect the ethos, the architectural tradition, the long architectural tradition of India. It must reflect that. Would anyone looking today at the Shastri Bhavan, built within a decade of India's independence, say remotely that it reflects the architectural soul of India? And there are number of such public buildings. For those sitting in Pondicherry can look at the Secretariat on the beachfront and say whether it reflects the architectural spirit of India. So, from physical manifestation to cultural and spiritual, intellectual, we had neglected all of this for so many years. It was not sufficient to just write a book on the discovery of India and then call Le Corbusier to, design Chandigarh. I mean, it's okay. Perhaps that was what was required. And even such mundane things as our airports. Only one building, one can say that the Vidhan Saudha in Karnataka, in Bangalore, reflects somewhat the Kannada, the architectural essence of that phase. Why did we miss out on these things? Why was not an education commission instituted right after independence saying that we want to completely restructure our education structure? A Sanskrit commission was instituted with Suniti Kumar Chatterjee as chairperson, strong recommendations which were never implemented. So, what I see is 7 decades after all this, and one can go on making a list. Please read Mother's interview on 26 January 1965 on Republic Day, where she says yoga must be part of our curriculum. And mother said this 50, 60, 70 years ago, yoga must be made part. Yoga must be taught in schools. Why was that? Why was it found so formidable that it did not happen? So I think there is a churning taking place. There are many things that are happening now. We are seeing them happening. They're happening against great odds. They're not happening perhaps fully. Somewhat they are manifesting. They are manifesting themselves partially. The process has started. And this process is bound to continue. I believe this is irreversible.
Thank you, sir, for so clearly putting the answer. And I'm hopeful that as we at Rostrum are part of this journey and creating the new ideas and institutions for a new India in the vision of Sri Aurobindo, more and more people join us and more institutions sprang up to create the futuristic vision. And really grateful to you for your address, and I'm sure that many those who are with us in the Zoom session and also watching it live would all reflect on this and join this manthan. Now I would like to introduce my colleague Priyank Chauhan to moderate the panel discussion. Priyank is a research associate at Rostrum School of Public Leadership. He has a master's from Jawaharlal Nehru University. And welcome Priyank to moderate the panel discussion.
Namaskar, everyone. Thank you, Abhishek, for the wonderful introduction. I would also like to introduce two participants that we have today for the panel discussion. Sri Devadeep Ganguly grew up at the Sri Aurobindo International Center of Education at Pondicherry. After completing his studies in 2004, he joined Sri Aurobindo Ashram as a full-time resident. Since then, he has been offering courses on the history, art, and culture of India, as well as on the social and political thought of Sri Aurobindo at the undergraduate level in Ashram School. He also assists the trustees of Sri Aurobindo Ashram in their administrative responsibilities. He is also Rostrum's guest faculty for the module on social and political philosophy of Sri Aurobindo as part of one-year certificate course titled Sri Aurobindo, the Rishi of Indian Renaissance. Sri Raghav Krishnaji is co-founder and associate dean academics at Rostrum School of Public Leadership. He carries 17 years of corporate experience with expertise in leading cross-functional creative product development teams. After his corporate stint, he moved into public policy to engage directly with India's governance needs. He is a student of Indian civilizational thought and is currently pursuing his PhD from Chinmaya Vishwavidyapeeth. He is also the founder of Trikarana Learning and Development Solutions, where he trains corporates and universities on creative product development skills such as design thinking, decision making, and mental models and leading creative teams. I welcome both of them to this panel discussion on the Indian spirit of nationalism. The relevance of this discussion cannot be overstated, not only because as a nation we face grave challenges today, but also because nationalism as a historical force, it is part of the emotional, social, and political reality of our nation. What we have in nationalism is a very motivating and uniting force. The role of this public discussion is to contextualize what has been already stated, the frame of Sri Aurobindo's thought on nationalism. So to contextualize this discussion, we will begin with the question of nationalism. What are the different articulations of nationalism that we see in India today, and what are the different contestations against it? And in these articulations, different contestations, and this clash of worldviews, where exactly do we locate the spirit of Indian nationalism as was envisioned by our thinkers like Sri Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda, all these great thinkers? Where exactly do we locate the spirit of Indian nationalism today? We will start with Raghav Krishnaji.
Thank you, Priyank, and namaste. Good evening to everyone. It's a little bit, it's with a lot of gratefulness and also a little bit of trepidation that we are try to speak after somebody like Bharat Gupji and Anirbanji's wonderful lecture. But I think both the conversations so far, or both the addresses so far, have actually also located in some ways the question that Priyanka has just posed to us. Of course, the job that we have now is to take the idea of nationalism, understand the unique nature of India's nationalism, and locate that in the contestations, and also try and think about a way forward. But there was something distinct about the characteristic of the speeches that we heard. Bharatji reminded us of the core essence of Sanatana Dharma, and he reminded us of Sri Aurobindo's conception of Sanatana Dharma as Indian nationalism. And that, rediscovering that, living that, and propagating that would be, what we would call civilizational nationalism in many senses. But he also qualified that with a statement about the current time. He said, we are in challenging times. In fact, he he emphasized on that dimension quite a bit, that there are certain forces that are antithetical. And there was a bit of a caution in the way that he brought this idea to us, and a sense of urgency that Bharatji infused. And contrast that with the message that we got from Anirbanji's message, both drawing from the same fount. But there was in Anirbanji's address a call for us to contextualize what we are experiencing as a phenomenon. We call that New India. Personally, perhaps not really my favorite term, but he asked us to contextualize that in the sense of where we are in the historical, political, socio-economic spheres, and how we are able to see a rejuvenation. And if you are able to observe that contrast, although drawing from the same fount and all of us going back to Sri Aurobindo's philosophy, we would notice that there are contestations within the fold as well, if you will. Right? And this is quite representative of the debates and the discussions that we have around what nationalism is. And I completely agree with Priyank that nationalism is a hugely motivating force. It animates the very impulse of all of our actions. But there is also a tendency in modern nationalism for all of that to be equated to state building. Nationalism demands a certain kind of adherence and performance. So, we have to be aware of the different dynamics of nationalism and how nationalism is interpreted and how it is decoded, in the discourse. But be that as it may, to just sort of think about the presence that Sri Aurobindo and Swami Vivekananda have in all of our conversations at Rostrum. Their spirit really looms large. And I think this is a great opportunity for us in the next 1 hour to try and cogitate on some of these aspects. I'll quickly spell out what I consider to be 2 or 3 main forms of nationalism that we see today. One, of course, draws from the taxonomy that the West has given us. There are at least 4 or 5 kinds of nationalisms that have emerged in the West, starting with the humanitarian nationalism to the Jacobin nationalism to, let's say, the traditional nationalism of Burke. And finally, of course, liberal nationalism. They also, interestingly, have something called an integral nationalism. But the idea of integral is, completely antithetical to how we understand it, particularly students of Sri Aurobindo's thought. If you look at this panoply of, the discourse of nationalism in the West, it's clearly, it's evident that the liberal nationalism has won the day. At least, it clearly is still the dominant force, although there is a lot of challenges to liberal nationalism. The institutional architecture that we've inherited, and regardless of whether you consider yourself politically conservative or liberal, or some other kind of label that you would like to attach, the institutional setup is largely liberal nationalism, right? And that tries to combine the idea of individual liberty along with a strong state, and that is, of course, reflected in the idea of nation states. The contestation to liberal nationalism is coming from largely, what we would call civilizational state or a civilizational nationalism, which draws on the culture dimension. And there again, we'll have to, particularly from our perspective as Indians, we will have to tread this discourse extremely skillfully Because when we inherit and use some of these terms like conservative, or when we try to articulate a position against liberal nationalism, espousing a cultural civilizational view, there is also the burden that we carry of the arguments that have happened within the Western Hemisphere, where they draw from the fount of their religious experience, which is again not the source that we draw our discourse from. So in the Indian context, while there is a clear articulation of the idea of civilizational nationalism, it is important, it is imperative that we always associate that with what Bharat Gupji told us today and what Sri Aurobindo reminded us all those years ago, that it is Sanatana Dharma, which is Bharatiya civilization. And when we talk about Indian civilizational nationalism, we are drawing from that font. There is also the idea of civic nationalism. Like broadly, you could say that this is the liberal paradigm. But the idea is that we are capable of employing reason, and there is a certain kind of solidity to constitution. And therefore, if you are able to live as a society, come together as a society on the basis of constitution, that is the way forward. So we see these contestations, and there is also within the civilizational nationalism, you see a fork in the road, where there is an idea of territorial nationalism sort of gaining ascendance over, let's say, the civilizational dimension. So if we were just to quickly look at the landscape, we have on one hand the templated version of liberal nationalism coming to us from the West. And you can say that civic nationalism sort of aligns itself with that in the idea of democracy and republic and constitutional patriotism. Then you have on the other side civilizational nationalism, which also has two components, which are also sort of having a discourse and dialogue within the ambit of civilizational nationalism. One is seeking to draw the inspiration from India's past and anchors itself on the Bharatiya vision. And the other one anchors itself on Bharat, but in a territorial sense. And both of them have their own performative dynamics. And I think we'll explore that. I'm looking forward to hear from Devdipji on this.
So this idea of civilizational nationalism, we will be coming back to it later. But first, I would like to invite Devdi Ganguly ji to deliberate on the same question. Where do we locate the spirit of Indian nationalism today?
Yeah, I think, so firstly, thank you for giving me the opportunity, and it's really wonderful to have heard all the esteemed speakers before me. So about your question, I think when we talk about the spirit of Indian nationalism, especially in the light of Sri Aurobindo, it's also interesting to see how his writings on India and on nationalism change or evolve and develop from the time that he was participating in the freedom movement to his later writings towards the end of his life. And so when we look at the 15th August message, so the 15th August message is the message that Sri Aurobindo gave to the All India Radio on the Independence Day in 1947. And he speaks about 5 dreams. Those 5 dreams are very indicative. We don't have the time to go into the 5 dreams now, but for those of you who are interested, strongly recommend that you read the 15th August message of Sri Aurobindo. But it's interesting to note that he speaks about nationalism is a theme which runs through that text. And there is, of course, reference to the freedom and unity of India, not a partitioned India, but India undivided. There is reference to Asia, the resurgence of Asia, and there is also the reference to the movement of internationalism. So when we are speaking about nationalism, I think one idea that I would like to just bring in is internationalism. And very often when we speak of nationalism, so especially in the way Raghavji just beautifully gave us a very brief but comprehensive overview of these different approaches to nationalism, and we speak of internationalism, it's often seen as if nationalism and internationalism are opposed to each other in some form. It's often seen as if you cannot be strongly nationalist if you believe in the internationalist movement or tendency. And what I think is very important to understand is in the context of Indian nationalism, especially when we say Vishwaguru, or when the mother of Pondicherry, when she gives the message that India must be the guru of the world. So what does this really mean? And I think there is an answer for us there. because Indian nationalism is not opposed to a broader movement of world unity and sympathy with broader global movements. It is not something that is antagonistic. On the contrary, it would be a mistake to think about internationalism as something where we give up our identities and sort of merge into some sort of globalized homogeneity. It would be a terrible mistake. And it is here that Indian nationalism has answers for us. Because on one hand, if you think about nationalism, it is essentially a problem or a question of identity. And from our very earliest historical, cultural, civilizational period, we have been fascinated as a people by the question of identity. If you go through the Upanishads, which is one of our foundational texts, you will see they're all about identity. Who are we? Who is the self? Who are we as a person, as an individual? And there is one idea which has been beautifully expressed by the speakers before me, is that the notion of the self being one and also many. So Bharatji mentioned about some of these important ideas that come down to us. And so this notion of oneness, being rooted in oneness and yet being capable of manifesting in many. And so when we speak about nationalism and internationalism, I think here there is a very important point to make, that Indian nationalism is able to reconcile this problem in a way that many other cultures or many other intellectual approaches, rather, I would say, are not able to do so. And nationalism, again, when you think of it in the modern context, coming more specifically to your question, almost seems to have a bad, almost seems to be a bad word in the West. And this is again because of the experience of nationalism through the 20th century. So when you see how movements in the 20th, early to mid 20th century led to nationalism being hijacked by very strongly, sort of xenophobic, a word was used earlier, xenophobic forces, very narrow, limited notions of identity took over that word. And we saw what happened in Europe in the name of nationalism. And so there is an automatic association of nationalism with something very negative. And it remains to this day to some extent. The moment you say nationalism, there is almost a recoil in the mind of many people, because they feel, oh, this is a danger, you're going down a dangerous path. And there is, of course, if it is indeed that sort of understanding that we have of the word, then certainly there is a danger. But in its inherent, by its inherent spirit, in its inherent nature, Indian nationalism, when it is rooted on something fundamental and deeper, again, the reference to the Uttar speech and the Sanatana Dharma, when it is rooted on that foundation, it is intrinsically nationalistic and yet something that involves, that accepts, that celebrates the diversity of the world.
So Devji, interestingly, you have talked about the concept of identity, and Raghavji earlier talked about the idea of civilizational nationalism. So I think both of these are intimately linked, as Sri Aurobindo also sought the essence of nationalism in the content of civilization. But today we have this idea and this very complex contest of identity going on in India. That all of identities, can the idea of civilization, can it address all of the questions of identity? For example, people who consciously dissociate themselves from a Sanatana identity, how would this idea of civilizational nationalism, how can it address them? And does it need to be reformulated for that? Where would the answer for that come from? I will pose this question again to Raghavji first. What is the essence of civilizational nationalism, and how can it include people who consciously and deliberately move away from the idea of that eternal civilization?
Thank you. And I think this is really the core of the debate that we need to have. And I think it's very clear that the job of intellectuals and people who think about Bharat in a civilizational sense is twofold. One is to reclaim the idea and the imagery and the sort of emotion that the word nationalism itself evokes, like Devji just reminded us. And this is the burden of vocabulary in that sense, because we are using these words drawn from a certain historical experience. While we might have a different sense of that word, it is difficult to ask all the people who carry a different memory of that to disassociate all of those other meanings and sort of negotiate with that vocabulary in the way we want them to. So that is job number one. The other, and linked to that is the question that you asked, Priyank, in the sense that if some people do not share your definition, how do you morally and intellectually convince them? And I think this is the job that we have ahead in the context that if Bharat as a idea and the nationalism anchored in Bharat as a civilizational entity is what we are espousing, clearly the temperament is also about debate, dialogue, and assimilation, and it cannot be hegemonic. In fact, the moral content of our idea of nationalism is coming from that core kernel that when we talk about nationalism, we do not impose or we do not seek to impose the idea of what we have on you. That has not been the Sanatana Dharma way. Right? There are 4 challenges to this, and scholars have written about this. I've read Jaideep Mazumdarji write about this quite a bit. Firstly, the idea of when we say civilizational nationalism, obviously we anchor on the idea of Dharma, and Kapil Kapoorji says it in his inimitable style, that Bharat has a unwritten 5,000-year-old one-word constitution, and that is Dharma. There is a received meaning, there is a lived meaning, and there is an intellectual understanding of this word for those who come from within the culture. Right? But we are trying to negotiate, have a dialogue with people who probably don't and have a different intellectual compass. So there is a challenge in a world that is organized as nation states, historically or otherwise. This has come to be a reality. We are recognized as nation states today, and there are boundaries, and all of world affairs is carried out as nation states dealing with each other. So for those of us who are espousing a civilizational state view, there are a few questions and a few challenges that we need to answer. First would be, if your core idea is Dharma as a civilization, and if you are also going to anchor on history and say that the Indian civilization, on the basis of Dharma and on the basis of its metaphysics, spread all over the world in a non-conquering, non-hegemonic way. But let's say it has left its impressions all the way up to Southeast Asia and perhaps going into Europe. What do you consider to be a civilization? Would you consider those lands to be part of your civilization today? Why would they accept if that is the question? So there is the job that we have to do of articulating what we mean by civilizational state in the context of Dharma, and also saying that we draw from our historical experience of Dharma being the basis for the world. Right? Secondly, there is a challenge of explaining in more quotidian terms, right? In more everyday terms, what does a civilizational nationalism really mean? How is it different? As a normal person going about my life on a day-to-day basis, what are the things that are impacted if we were to anchor on civilizational nationalism as opposed to, let's say, civic nationalism, or as opposed to territorial nationalism, right? So there, I think, we'll have to bring out the dynamics of what your cultural experience is going to be, and what is also going to be your national strategy. And it has to acquire some kind of doctrinal power for people to follow. At this point, I don't think we have the doctrinal power. We have the imagery and we have the vision of what a civilizational nationalism looks like. But I think there is a lot of intellectual, academic, scholarly, and cultural work pending to try and infuse a little bit of a doctrine into it. Right? Also, the challenge is that as a world organized in nation states, and when we say we are a dharmic culture and Bharatiya nationalism is Sanatana Dharma, by definition, it also means that those nation states which are, let's say, grounded in a theocracy or a theology or a religion that do not accept Dharma, how do you deal with that? In a geopolitical, geo-economic sense, what are the real trade-offs? You really cannot say that we will not deal, with Saudi Arabia in trade, for example. Right? How do you locate your dialogue with all of them? So this is the work that we need to have, or we need, that is pending, to articulate what the vision of civilizational state is, or a civilizational nationalism is, and how it maps and deals with the rest of the world that has already organized itself into a certain paradigm. Does it mean that there is no example or there is no logic to the argument of civilizational nationalism? I would say no. Broadly, the moral vision for civilizational nationalism comes from the vision that we have of what it can do to Indians themselves. And this is when we talk about the deepest spiritual fount that Bharatji mentioned and Devdipji also alluded to, there is really no, there is no really risk or there is absolutely no content that excludes in that vision. Yes, we need to have a dialogue with people who do not profess that identity, but that identity is not an exclusivist identity. So I think the challenge is for us to convince the rest of, let's say, the Indian population itself who does not share this idea, that this is not a hegemonic or this is not a exclusivist idea that seeks to impose itself and that it seeks to derive political capital out of creating divisions in a multi-party competitive polity. I think we need to decouple the idea of civilizational nationalism from the politics of democracy. And we need to articulate a superior vision for what it means to human experience. So that is the work that we need to do internally, even as we cogitate on what does it mean in terms of India's engagements as a nation state, as others identify us, and how does it redraw our relationships with the rest of the world.
I will invite Devdeep Ganguly ji to answer the same question. The question again is whether the idea of nationalism, the frame in which we are talking about, can it answer all the questions of identity that we face today? Whether we need to reformulate or recombine the idea of nationalism or identity itself, and can we seek answers to these questions in the works of thinkers like Sri Aurobindo?
So yes, I mean, certainly I think the answers are there. Raghavji gave a very cogent, intellectual answer to the question that you have put in terms of the work that has to be done and the paradigms that have to be developed. When we speak about Sri Aurobindo, there is one text of his which came to my mind. It's actually a text that he wrote in Bengali in a journal called Dharma, which was published in December 1909, where he takes up this issue and addresses it. And I just want to read out a passage if I'm permitted to, because I think that on one hand there is a work that has to be done at many levels. So there is the intellectual work of developing a paradigm that fits in all these different aspects under an umbrella which everyone can feel a part of. There is also a work of the heart, a work of feeling, because that is where the roots are. There has to be a sentiment. It is not so much intellectual conviction in the end, but a sentiment which transcends these things. And so here there is something which Sri Aurobindo writes, which I find very inspiring. He says, "The country and nothing but the country is the foundation of nationalism. Neither the nation nor religion, nothing else matters. All other elements are secondary and contributory. It is the country alone that is primary and essential. Many mutually exclusive races live in the land. Perhaps there never was enough goodwill, unity, or friendliness. What is there in that to worry about?" Please note that he's writing this at a time when we are not an independent country, where all these questions have not been resolved in any form, right? So they're all burning questions in a certain sense. So he says, what is there in that to worry about? When it is one country, one mother, there is bound to be unity one day. And out of the union of many races shall emerge a strong and invincible nation. Our religious views may differ. There might be endless conflict among the communities, neither concordance nor any hope of concordance. Still, one need not have any misgivings. By the powerful magnetic attraction of the mother embodied in the country, by fair means or foul, whether by mutual understanding or by force or by appeasement, harmony will be achieved. Communalism, separation will be drowned in fraternal feelings, in a common love and worship of the mother. And then a little further on, he says, he continues the same idea. He says, one need not fear. He says, there is nothing permanent about these obstacles. It's a very beautiful passage. He says, this is a law of nature, the lesson of history everywhere. The country is the base of nationalism, an inevitable bond. When there is a country of one's own, nationalism is bound to be there. On the other hand, if the country is not one, even if the race, the religion, and the language are the same, nothing will come of that. So I think it is really about looking deeper into ourselves and seeing where is that fount of feeling where we feel one. Because if we go into these specific religious debates and discussions, we will find ourselves hitting against a wall at some point, because there is a certain mutual exclusivity about certain traditions that you cannot get over. But there is a fundamental sense of unity which transcends these theological debates, and that is where we must find our sense of nationalism, irrespective of the differences that people might have.
I would like to add here that at the end of this discussion, we will be inviting questions. So if you have any questions, you can send them on chat and we will take a few of those. So the question here, I would like to just extend the argument that we have been having. So we heard the phrase Indian exceptionalism a few times in today's discussion and also in the keynote address and the inaugural address. So a question that comes here is, when we are making India the ground of our thinking and we are talking about Indian exceptionalism, what exactly is the character of Indian exceptionalism, not just at the level of thought, but also in our practical reality today, and not simply as a practical reality, but also in the realm of possibility. So I invite both of the participants to deliberate on this question. Where do we look for the idea of Indian exceptionalism today? We can begin with Raghavji.
Sure. Yeah, and I've reflected on this question, more also as an exercise to be clear in our own advocacy, right? If we are taking a certain position, what is the prayojana? What is the lokasamgraha that comes out of it? And ultimately, as Mahabharata tells us, the sum total of all knowledge is governance, is service. And Devdipji really, elevated the conversation when he read out Sri Aurobindo's vision. And as always, and this is amazing how many times this happens to me personally, all of the questions somehow seem to find an answer in Sri Aurobindo's writings, and constantly wondered at the grace of our gurus, and particularly Sri Aurobindo in a personal experience, where a lot of these questions seem to have been anticipated and provided for, not just in an intellectual sense, but also in the sense of sadhana, right? In the sense that there is a consciousness preparation that has happened for us to draw and be able to articulate and live these ideas, right? So what are those constituent elements? What are the elements that comprise Indian exceptionalism if we are to advocate this? One, at a strategic level, if you look at it like any other nation, this is a story that you give yourself and you go out and tell the story to the world and deal with the world. That could be one way to think about it. And lastly, this is how all exceptionalisms, in my understanding, are sort of formulated, right? You say you are manifest destiny, or you say you are the center of the world, or you are the empire and everybody else is a periphery, and you deal with the world with the story that you give in yourself. It is given the name of grand strategy, or it is given as a doctrine to the nations itself. But I don't think those approaches quite sum up what Bharat's attitude will be, or what is really a representation of Sanatana Dharma. And the one area where I find the real answer to how Indian exceptionalism is inextricably linked to global welfare is in the idea of ecology and environment. We are going through a period of massive planetary crisis, and science tells us, our own lived experience tells us that Anthropocene is real, and there is a real risk that human actions have reached a stage which have very, very profound consequences for our own existence, not so much for the future of planet, but for the survival of humans as a race or as a collective. So the question really, some of the grand challenges that we have in the world today are about how do you manage, or how do you solve, or how do you even approach solving a situation where we have expanded the resource utility, and therefore the choice that is available to us. And therefore it has also created a certain samskara, it has created a certain habit, it has created a certain idea of life for 10 billion people. But you're also reaching the limits of Earth's ability or planet's ability to provide for that. Right? Ultimately, all of us, whether you are in US or in China or India, fundamentally are in the pursuit of joy. That is the foundational basis for any human experience. And this is also the basis for India's nationalism, that it has to provide for a way of experiencing sukha. Now, we have equated sukha with materialism or consumption. There is a certain idea that as you ascend a quality of life that is able to consume more, that is the joy and that is the definition of joy. And now we have a problem of scaling it up to 10 billion people, because this is a story that we've told them in a globalized world, because the whole idea of or the moral and intellectual promise of globalization is that it would uplift the standards of life, which is equated to consumption, for 10 billion people across the world, and therefore free trade and organizing ourselves as nation states, getting into unilateral and bilateral arrangements is morally and intellectually the right thing to do. Okay? But there is a recognition that the story is beginning to fade. The data is staring at us. SDGs, as we call them, the vocabulary used for formulating this, the Sustainable Development Goals, formulated in 2015, and a review of those by 2020 tells us that we are not only not making progress on any of those goals, we are actually making a regress on each of the important ecological and economic and human welfare related sustainable development goals committed to by the Committee of Nations, and with tremendous intellectual capital and other resources put together over 5 years, has led us to a situation where we are making a regress and not progress. Right? So clearly, as a collective, regardless of whether it is American exceptionalism, Chinese exceptionalism, or Indian exceptionalism, there is currently a trajectory for all of us as humanity, which is not looking healthy. Right? I situate the idea of Indian exceptionalism drawing from the fount of philosophy of Upanishads, from Vedas, and of course articulated and brought to us in our experience through the words of Sri Aurobindo, Swami Vivekananda in more recent times, as something that is capable of defining joy in a slightly different way, or profoundly different way, if you want to put it that way. And that is the only sustainable way for 10 billion people to live, exercise their agency, find happiness, and be within the planetary boundaries and ecological ceilings. Right? To me, when we talk about the Indian exceptionalism, it comes from the idea of going within to find other sources of joy, to actually go into the infinite expanse of your own soul or heart that Devdipji mentioned. And actually, that is the vision that we carry to the world, not just as a gospel that Sri Aurobindo also really exhorted us to, but also as an urgent imperative for global governance to pay attention to. So I locate the moral content of India's exceptionalism in the way it is able to provide a means for people to experience joy at scale, because we keep hearing this word scale in a business and in a national context. I think what we need to think about when we talk about scale is really how do you enable pursuit of happiness and joy in a meaningful and sustainable way at scale to 10 billion people. And I think India has the answer. That is our exceptionalism, and that comes from Sanatana Dharma.
That's a really comprehensive answer. But I would like to pose the same question to Devdipji again. Where do we locate the spirit of Indian exceptionalism? Not only at the level of thought, but also in the realm of practical possibility for today and also for the future.
Yeah, firstly, I just want to thank Raghavji for that very interesting answer. I think it's a very interesting approach that he presented for us, looking at it in the context of the real problems that we are facing in the world today. I can only, continue along the same lines and say that when we speak about Indian exceptionalism, we see already the influence of Indian thought and culture spreading out in various ways around the world, influencing societies and people, though it happens at a much more individual level and sometimes in a more quiet way. What I mean by quiet way is that when people turn for deeper seeking or knowledge to Indian knowledge systems, right, there is an inherent change that takes place in their in the way that they lead their lives, and that affects as of course, as Raghavji was saying, the way that they relate to joy and what they look for in their life, it also affects the way that they understand themselves and the world. And so for me, I would say the most important contribution of India to the world, and the role, this again links to what we have been discussing about Vishwa Guru, because again, that is a term that can be so easily misinterpreted. If we think about Vishwa Guru or Guru of the world in terms of simply economic might or military might, and not that those are things which are not desirable. You certainly require yourselves to be prosperous and settled and comfortable and capable of defending yourself when necessary. But that cannot be the only approach, because then it's no different. There is no exceptionalism then. And so the exceptionalism really comes when it draws upon the vast truth that the civilization has discovered and which must now become effective. So as a direct response to your question, I would say it is now no longer sufficient for us to look back at the past as something that is fixed and something that has been. That wisdom and knowledge have to become effective in the way that we live our lives today, in terms of whether it's politics or ecology or civilization. And so that message of change, not just individually, but also spreading out to collectively, message of a growth of consciousness, message of moving to a higher way of being and living and bringing that inner perfection outward, would be something that is very unique to India's contribution to the world.
So, linked to that question, one thing I find really interesting about Sri Aurobindo's articulation of nationalism is just how expansive it is and how inclusive. So, as speakers have already noted, the nationalism does not cancel out the global dimension of human existence. And when he elevates nationalism to the spiritual level, at that level, it is connected both to humanity as a whole, but also to the individual human person. So that opens up new avenues of thinking. On the same lines, this is something that I wanted to ask at a creative level. How do we engage with globalization, forces of globalization and localization, both above and below the national level of thinking? How do we engage with them creatively using this idea of nationalism that we have?
Yeah, I'll give a very brief answer. I think this requires a greater exposition and greater thinking, very specific and a very directed thinking for us to actually take a position. And I have not taken a position, to be honest, on this yet. But Sri Aurobindo, I think, gives us the answer. You don't even need to intellectualize it in a certain way. You visit the ashram or you look at anything that is involved. That the ashram does, or that Sri Aurobindo movement or Sri Aurobindo consciousness generates, there is a certain kind of artistic quality to it, and there is a certain kind of beauty and symmetry to it. And Sampadananji always reminds us of the associations mother has made to flowers, right, and the gunas that she has given to different flowers. All of that is actually the highest, the work of the highest creative order in essentializing nature and our interactions with nature. And this is going to be a central theme, I would imagine, Priyank, because apart from the ecology dimension, the other dimension that I would say India's exceptionalism would anchor on, and which has a huge amount of scope for creative expression, is the fact that there is a vacuum, a psychological, emotional vacuum that is pervasive in the world today. And that, there is a yogic explanation to it. There is obviously a historical and materialistic explanation to it, but it is pervasive. We see it all around us. So we need creative mediums now, and the mediums also are there. In a certain way, I say that with the proliferation of mass media and social media today, you have a situation where Sanskrit and Pali go together. Right? You can have an idea that diffuses itself extremely effectively in multiple mediums in a highly localized way. And you also have the source material in your civilization in the form of stories, anecdotes, multiple philosophies, really the multi-sided flowering of the human mind that Sri Aurobindo spoke about. And he always reminds us that it was not a culture that was dormant. It does not leave any space. In fact, in his riposte to the Western thinking and Western accusation about Indian culture and Indian art, he gives us a glorious explanation of the Indian thinking and how it finds an expression in the world around us. Right. So he gave us the sequence that you first realize the spiritual vision, you understand the philosophies, you bring it down to art, and then finally to polity. Right. The sequence is given to us. And I think in all of these spheres, there is tremendous scope for creative expression today. And that I think also is in a certain way, at Rostrum, we think of ourselves as civilizational interlocutors, right? We are trying to be the bridge between civilizational knowledge systems, civilizational essence, and our own generations, around generation and generations to come, who are trying to find a more reliable anchor than just the idea of material pursuit gives them, right? So I think whether it is digital media, whether it is storytelling, whether it is dialogue, whether it is a new creative way of dialectic, all of these ideas and formats are available to us for the first time to actually, to actually be the purveyors of the consciousness that Sri Aurobindo meditated to bring down, in a certain sense to our realm. We now have the medium to actually, or the sort of global village concept to actually spread that. I don't have an answer for what is the exact format and the exact avenues. What I see is that the conditions are fertile.
So Devji, you have already talked about nationalism as a work of feeling along with a work of thought. So would you like to add something to what Raghavji has already said?
Sir, you're on mute.
Sorry, yes, I apologize. So just a little bit to say that when we talk about globalization and localization, again, these are all terms which have layers of meaning. You can understand globalization in terms of homogeneity, which is again something which is which is completely negative and something that goes against the spirit of unity or of deeper understanding that we are trying to develop here. But you can also have globalization in the sense of being receptive and open to other cultures and learning about them and growing and widening yourself in many ways. And that can be something very positive. Again, localization, when we speak about localization, if it is putting yourself, surrounding yourself in a cage, in a wall, and then saying this is the only thing that is of interest to me, it becomes something which is not progressive. And on the other hand, you can only know the world when you know yourself. And so a full development of your own tradition and culture and to be truly rooted in what is yourself gives you a basis to better engage and interpret and understand and relate to the world around you. And so I think both these movements have to be seen in the right spirit, and perhaps there is a reconciliation which is possible between what appears to be contradictory but is in fact not in essence.
So we have some interesting questions coming in, and I would like now to pose them to the panelists. Prakash Nair ji asks, if Sri Aurobindo ji spoke of Atmanirbharta, how can the idea of Atmanirbharta be related to Sri Aurobindo's thought? I would like to pose this question to Devdev Ganguly ji.
So there is one interesting... so Atmanirbharta, of course, if I understand correctly, is in relation to the policy of the government to encourage, local industry, manufacturing, and so on. So there is one interesting reference here. When Sri Aurobindo was working with the Maharaja of Baroda, that is after he came back from England, so after for about just before he entered the political period, so early 20th century, in the early 1900s and the late 1800s. So there is a speech. He used to often write speeches for the Maharaja. And there is one speech where he talks about industry, developing of industry. And it's a very interesting speech. And of course, now we can't take that as something that is you cannot take something that was written more than 100 years ago and say that this is as relevant today as it was then. But it is interesting to note how much he stresses on the importance of developing commerce and industry for the growth of the state that he was associated with at that point of time. But beyond that, it's not a term that he refers to in any direct way.
So another interesting question that we have is, how can we imbibe the spirit of Vasudevam Sarvamiti, inclusivity of nature and matter? How can the challenge is to incorporate this spirit in the education system and culture? What can be the roadmap for it? Both of you are free to take this question.
Well, we are currently running a faculty development program spread over 19 days on India's knowledge systems to answer precisely this question. Right? I think it would be an illusion if we say that we've got all figured, but it's not. Actually, what we call a civilization is an inheritance of this wisdom, of this ability to just live together in all our complexity, in all our diversity, in all of our frailty as well as humans trying to live with nature. This has been not just codified, but also given a beautiful pedagogical elevation in the form of Itihasa, Purana stories that are available to us. What we're trying to do, and Devdeepji reminded us, Anirbanji's message had that essence. Bharatji, of course, anchored his entire message on that. In a lot of ways, this is not about trying to create new knowledge always. There is some component of that because the context changes. But it is a creative reconciliation of what you already have with your current context. And there is a lot of research material already available to us in the form of blueprints on education. Bharatji himself, in his book, Indian Culture, Decline or Revival, has given what I consider to be still one of the best pieces on education that I've seen. To give you a quick example of what this means, right? We all must have heard that the Bharatiya education vision did not have this separation of humanities, arts, and sciences into silos. It was truly an integrated vision, and that is why you see mathematics expressed as poetry. Now, what does it really mean? How does this mind flower? Why was it separated? It got separated because there was a certain kind of need to create specialized professions for the industry, right? That is the form that the academic structure took. And therefore, as a result of that, all of us go through a system which looks at engineering, computer sciences, management, arts, literature, philosophy as separate disparate streams, which was not the vision of education in India. Imagine learning about mathematics, visiting a temple. You are sitting in a temple and you're trying to understand trigonometry by looking at what are the equations that play if you were to be in that temple. That is just one example of a creative pedagogical leap that we can take to teach mathematics in a environment that is real and in a way that you can touch, feel. A lot of this research is going on in Rostrum as well currently in all of our programs. There is at least a list of 10 pedagogical methods, the aphoristic method, the sutra method, the dialectic method, the question and answer method. All of these tools have been used if we are able to just access our own knowledge systems. So the answer to your question is, we go back and study not just the content, but also the creative transmission mechanisms that have been created by the civilization. And in doing that, we would be able to find ideas that we can hang on to and we contemporize that.
Devdeepji, you have worked on the concept and practice of education. Would you like to add to that question?
If you don't mind, can you repeat the question once more?
Yeah. The question is, how can the spirit of Vasudevam Sarvamiti, the inclusivity of nature and matter, how can be implemented in education system and culture? Is there any roadmap that can be made for it?
Yeah, I think it's it's a question with which requires a lot of thought and application of a lot of minds to come together and to really think deeply about how these ancient approaches can become living truths today. It's one thing to speak about them or talk about them in a philosophical sense. How does one convey it and make them part of our daily existence? So that is really the challenge. I can't really say much about this because I think it requires a lot more, time and thinking on the part of many people. Here in Pondicherry, at the school, at the ashram school, it's something which is, I would say, there is something which is conveyed through the education here, which is not systematized, but which is conveyed through the atmosphere and through the atmosphere of the environment, of course, of the mother's physical presence when she was there. But even, I would say today, just the atmosphere of the ashram and the people who come here primarily inspired by their vision, and that itself conveys something. And so one of the most important tools in education, especially when subtler things have to be conveyed, I feel, is when you're surrounded by people who are trying to live that truth in their life. It is often a more persuasive example than being told mentally that's you need to do this. And so I think growing up here in Pondicherry, we were fortunate that there were people around us who, to the extent that they could, were seeking out these deeper ideas that you just referenced to in your question. And that itself conveys something, that it brings something into the atmosphere. For those who are ready, for those who have some opening, it can leave quite a strong mark. And I think this is something that was also understood in the ancient perspective very strongly, which is why you had the whole system of the Gurukul, and the teacher was one who was not just somebody who knew mentally, but who was also a living embodiment of the principles that he or she taught. And I would end with one sentence of the mother where she says, the teacher must be a yogi. So the ideal teacher is one who is living a deeper life.
We will take just one last question. This question is addressed to Rostrum especially, but I think it has a broad relevance because we are talking about the practical reality of things. So this question, I think Raghavji would like to address this. The question is, how does Rostrum plan to reach out to Indian masses and global masses to explain the universal diversity and inclusion of Sanatana Dharma as a universal principle? If you can explain it from an outside-in perspective.
Sure. Yeah. Thank you for this question. And I know that this is not a forum set up to talk about Rostrum, but since it has come up, I'll try and explain very briefly what we are attempting to do. We think of ourselves as an interlocutor institution, and our concern is to build self-aware and civilizationally assured public leadership. And this is also, like I mentioned, Sri Aurobindo's thought and philosophy looms large. And in our conception, when we think about the challenges that we have as a nation and civilization today, we see that the sort of flow that you expect in a civilization has been hindered because of a certain kind of incoherence between three fundamental realms. Right? And I go back to also link it to the idea of nationalism itself. We spoke about identity, but the two other anchors or two other concerns of a civilization or nation would be stability and prosperity. How do you recognize who you are? How do you come together? And how do you then generate prosperity for a large number of people who are able to then, take part in your national vision? And this we equate to the idea of Ichcha Shakti, Jnana Shakti, and Kriya Shakti, which is also inspired by Sri Aurobindo's conception of Bharata Shakti itself. And in that, we try to map out the realms in the society today that are responsible for stitching this vision together. So if you think about Ichcha, then the realm is obviously the political leadership or the direct representation that happens because policy comes from that class. If you think about Jnana Shakti, then you also need to have a certain kind of coherence and a certain kind of idea in academic leadership. You need academic institutions or universities, spaces of learning, which are grounded in this kind of thought. There is no bigger force multiplier than education itself. So there is Gnana Shakti that we have in the form of academic spaces, which produce the ideas of identity about who we are. There is Icha Shakti in the context of political will, which has to go through a representative process for it to reside in the minds and hearts of people. And finally, all of this has to lead to Kriya Shakti, which really comes from the society. It's not the state that produces the prosperity. It is the creative enterprise of people, all of us coming together, who produce prosperity. So our philosophy is that Icha Shakti, Gnana Shakti, and Kriya Shakti, which are represented by the realms in the society that we have today, politics, academia, and civil society, they have to come together in the grand vision of Bharat as Shakti. We have to first create enough number of people who internalize this idea. But in the process of doing this, you have to have an anchor, and that anchor is the civilizational knowledge systems. Ultimately, what we conceptualize as Bharat, at least in our imagination, is not just the political experience or the social experience, but also the deeper spiritual knowledge system-based experience, which gives us our culture, which gives us our moorings, so to speak. Right? If we are able to do that, and if we are able to link it, and you might have seen this in the context of our conversation over the last 1 hour, my concern, and as a representative of the institution, my concern is how does our knowledge system inform the world today? What are the problems that the world is facing today? What are the problems that are likely to come up tomorrow? And do our knowledge systems have a way of addressing those, anticipating those, preempting those, and resolving those, and offering that as a service to the entire world? And we believe the answer is a affirmative, non-apologetic yes. We will be able to do that. And if we are able to create a format of education and a format of public policy thinking, so at the top level, you are working with the most important force or the most important actor that you have in any modern nation state, which is the idea of the state itself, which comes through us as public policy, which impacts all of our lives. So therefore, at the higher level, at the top level, you have the idea of public policy and governance, which has to be informed and influenced by India's knowledge systems and Bharatiya Jnana Parampara. At the culture and lived experience level, you also need this to percolate, which is through the medium of education. Our idea is if we are successful in creating leadership education anchored in this philosophy with creative pedagogies that is applicable and valuable to the world, this is a format that we can then offer to the rest of the nation in planting this into as many educational institutions as possible, as many governance institutions as possible, right? This becomes the software that we provide to the hardware that we have in the context of universities and in the context of political institutions and economic institutions. So that really is the work. And I think decade is a good enough time for us to try and target this. And that is where we think of scale. The scale is, of course, all of this also leads to investing in people. Ultimately, all of these ideas, all of our vision has to be seeded deeply into the hearts and minds of people. And that is why there is a leadership development program. So you're creating individuals who try and embody the spirit, but you're also trying to create the intellectual, philosophical, cultural assets and policy thinking around this, which can go and reside in multiple institutions. So Vaibhavji, to answer your question, our idea is to invest in people, at the same time create material that can also inform institutions.
That answer brings an end to today's discussion, and also to the third edition of Vaicārikī. For me personally, it was 2.5 hours of pure learning. It has given me inspiration to connect with works of people like Sri Aurobindo, and that is something I will be doing really soon. I would like to extend my thanks to Professor Bharat Gupta-ji for the inaugural address, in which he stressed the relevance of Sri Aurobindo's unequivocal equation of nationalism to Sanatana Dharma. I would also like to thank Dr. Anirban Ganguly-ji for his an hour-long deliberation on how the spirit of Indian nationalism is thriving and getting stronger in India today. I would like to thank both the panelists, Raghav Krishna ji and Devdeep Ganguly for that very enriching discussion that we had today. And I would also like to thank all the viewers, all the participants for being a part of this wonderful discussion. And I hope it was meaningful and useful for all of us. And you are all also welcome to the 4th edition of Vaicārikī, which we will be having soon. Thank you. Namaste.
Priyank, if I can just say a last word. I think Anirbanji and Bharat Gupji also mentioned about Sri Aurobindo's vision in the confinement of that cell, right? And he had a vision of Vasudeva. I see the image of Krishna behind you, and my first reaction was that the consciousness of Vasudeva is all around. Thank you for moderating this. Thank you also,
Thank
Abhishek.
you.
Wonderful speaking. Thank you, Devdeepji.
Thank you very much. Wonderful to be a part of this.